when you really want to grasp what's happening globally, skimming the headlines just doesn't cut it. You got to dig deeper, look at the hard data, the operational realities to see how nations are actually coping under pressure. Today, we're taking that deep dive into Russia's current strategic landscape. We're looking beyond the vulnerabilities to examine the adaptive, sometimes quite surprising measures they're taking. It's a critical assessment of how they're navigating a really challenging global environment.
That's absolutely right. Our intelligence paints a picture of a nation facing, well, intense external pressure from sanctions, but also simultaneously grappling with significant internal economic and social strains. And what's really key here is how these pressures are actively shaping their doctrine, their operational decisions day to day. We've basically distilled this down into 4 core areas for you today. First, the very murky world of the shadow oil trade. Second, the mounting domestic economic pressures like wage arrears. Third, some significant shifts in social policy we need to talk about. And finally, their ongoing struggle really for industrial self-reliance, particularly in the aviation sector. The goal here is to provide immediate situational clarity on these complex interlocking dynamics.
Okay, let's unpack that. Because the data we've collated, it really does paint a compelling picture. You see these incredibly complex strategies being employed to navigate what is, frankly, a hostile environment. So from a strategic perspective, what's the core objective we're seeing them drive towards? And what's the sort of broader context making them adapt like this?
Fundamentally, I'd say Russia's strategic objectives right now boil down to 3 main things. 1, keep the energy exports flowing. That's critical revenue to sustain the economy, obviously. 2, address some severe internal demographic challenges they're facing. And 3, push hard for industrial independence, especially since those sweeping international sanctions hit after 2022. The context, well, it's a sustained, relentless campaign of economic pressure from Western governments. That pressure is forcing Russia to adapt, and adapt quickly, often relying on let's call them covert or unconventional methods just to maintain stability and keep things running. It really is a high-stakes game of economic survival.
And this is where it gets really fascinating, right? When we dive into the actual operational framework, our sources are showing these intricate systems, everything from really quite brazen sanctions evasion tactics to these internal policy shifts that directly impact ordinary people's lives. Let's start on the economic front, because that's often where the pressure is felt first and hardest. Specifically, this shadow oil fleet we keep hearing reports about.
Right, the shadow trade. It's fascinating and honestly quite audacious in its scope. Britain's National Crime Agency, the NCA, they've flagged this quite prominently. They've identified 2 Azerbaijani nationals, Edipar Ayub and Tahir Gurayev. Now, these individuals are described as being close associates of Igor Sechin, the Rosneft CEO. And somehow they secured what sources call privileged access to Rosneft oil. This access apparently allowed them to trade more Russian crude in 2024 than any other single entity. We're talking huge volumes. Cargoes valued, get this, at over $24 billion.
Wait, hang on, $24 billion? That's an absolutely enormous amount of money. How on earth are they moving that kind of volume when they're supposedly under such intense scrutiny?
Well, the method isn't always super high-tech, which is maybe part of the deception. They primarily use a global fleet of over 100 aging tankers. Older ships that might attract less attention or are harder to track consistently. And their practices are deliberately deceptive. Things like routinely disabling their onboard tracking systems, the AIS, conducting ship-to-ship transfers out at sea to obscure the oil's origin, and constantly changing the national flags the ships sail under. It's a real cat-and-mouse game out there on the oceans.
So if I'm getting this right, it's almost like they're running 2 parallel operations. One that sort of tries to look legitimate on the surface, and another that's completely designed to operate in the shadows.
Precisely. They've set up this layered organizational structure. You've got what's been termed the Blue Group. Companies like Two Rivers DMCC, Two Rivers PTE. These try to maintain a facade of legitimacy, maybe even dealing with Western banks initially. Though, it's worth noting, many of those were specifically sanctioned by the UK last December. Then, in stark contrast, you have the Red Group. This is the really opaque side of the operation. Nord Axis is flagged as a key logistical hub here. They rely heavily on shell companies' easily replaceable offshore transfers, even blending different types of oil to disguise its provenance. The whole setup is designed to make tracing the origin incredibly difficult, if not impossible.
And the UK has tried to clamp down on this specifically.
They have, yes. In May 2025, the UK expanded its sanctions to directly target 5 Azerbaijani individuals, including Gurayev and Ayub. They also sanctioned firms like BX Energy, Romarine, and that key hub, Nord Axis. Plus over 100 tankers believed to be part of this network. But despite these efforts, the scale is still huge. The Kiev School of Economics estimates Russia is still exporting around 4.1 million barrels per day using this shadow fleet. It just underscores the immense challenge Western governments face in actually enforcing these restrictions effectively.
That's a staggering operation. But, beyond these high-stakes economic maneuvers, these pressures are clearly reshaping everyday life inside Russia, too. I was particularly struck by the reports on changes in social policy, especially around healthcare access. What exactly are we seeing there?
Yes, this moves us into a really critical area, arguably one of social control. Our sources report a very concerning trend. Emergency contraceptives and medical abortion drugs, specific brands like Genol and Genapristin, have, well, essentially vanished from pharmacy shelves in Russia. And this isn't just a supply chain issue. It seems quite deliberate. A health ministry regulation came into effect in September 2024. It reclassified mifepristone, which is the active ingredient in these drugs, classifying it as a list of regulated substance. What that means practically is you now need special prescription forms. And crucially, there's mandatory reporting of these prescriptions to the federal medical regulator, Rostovnadzor.
So it's not just a shortage, it's an active regulatory change designed to control, maybe even restrict, access.
Absolutely. It's very much like a deliberate policy lever. And the impact is measurable. We're seeing a significant decline in shipments of mifepristone and misoprostol to Russian hospitals. The numbers show a drop of about one-third in 2024 alone, down from roughly 938,000 packages to just over 636,000. Sources say this marks the lowest consumption level ever recorded for these medications. Now, this operational detail, this tightening of control, directly correlates with reports highlighting a national demographic crisis and record low birth rates in Russia. It appears to be a very direct state intervention in reproductive health, likely aimed at boosting population numbers, potentially at the expense of individual autonomy.
And sticking with the internal picture, what about the economic well-being of ordinary Russians? Are these broader pressures translating into hardship for workers?
We're definitely seeing alarming signs of economic strain filtering down, particularly a dramatic surge in unpaid wages or wage arrears. Official government statistics, they showed arrears tripling from about 500 million rubles in January to 1.5 billion by March 2025. But interestingly, the General Confederation of Trade Unions estimates the real figure is likely much higher. They put it at around 2.4 billion rubles just in the first quarter of 2025.
2.4 billion rubles. That's roughly, $30 million in unpaid wages just in 3 months? That sounds like a really widespread problem. Which sectors are being hit the hardest by this?
Is widespread, yeah. The data suggests major construction firms, manufacturing plants, and even basic services like water supply and waste management are struggling to meet payroll. We have specific examples. DSK, a road construction company in the Tver region, reportedly owed over 600 million rubles, that's about $8 million to nearly 4,000 employees. Or Shakhta Inskaya, an industrial equipment firm in Kemerovo, owing 65 million rubles, about $800,000. Rasvet, food services in Tula, owed 36 million rubles. The hardest hit regions geographically seem to be concentrated in the Ural Mountains and parts of Siberia. Now, a major contributing factor seems to be Russia's central bank maintaining a steep 20% key interest rate. This puts immense pressure on companies. They're forced into an impossible choice, either delay paying wages or risk defaulting on their loans. One economist noted that monthly debt servicing payments for some companies have inflated by 30, even 70%. It's unsustainable, and you see the human impact. A 37% increase in citizen complaints filed about wage delays in 2024 compared to the previous year, mostly coming from employees of small and medium-sized businesses.
That paints a really stark picture of internal economic fragility building up.
Okay, and the last piece you mentioned was this push for industrial self-reliance, particularly in aviation. How is that effort actually going, especially the attempt to replace all those Western aircraft?
Well, to put it bluntly, it's proving to be a real struggle, a significant struggle. We've seen really sharp price increases. We're talking 45 to 70% over just 2 years for the Russian-made passenger aircraft that are intended to replace Boeing and Airbus jets. To give you some concrete numbers, the MS-21 airliner now costs around 7.6 billion rubles. That's about $96 million US. The IL-114-300 turboprop has nearly doubled in price to 2.6 billion rubles, roughly $33 million. Even smaller planes like the LMS-901 Baikal have jumped from about 178 million rubles to somewhere between 315 and 320 million rubles, so over $4 million.
So they're trying to build their own replacements, but the costs are spiraling. Why is that happening? Is it just inflation or something more fundamental? It seems to be a combination of factors. Higher production costs domestically are certainly part of it. But crucially, Russia remains persistently dependent on imported parts for these supposedly domestic aircraft. Rostec, that's the state defense conglomerate overseeing this, they claim their initial cost estimates were just overly optimistic and that costs will eventually come down by 2030. But the current reality is starkly different. The reliance on foreign components is still very high. To even afford these expensive planes, the State Transport Leasing Company, GTLK, is proposing some rather drastic financial measures. They're recommending that the National Welfare Fund, Russia's sovereign wealth fund, should finance the full purchase price of these aircraft. And they're suggesting extending the lease terms out to 7, maybe even 10 years to make payments manageable for airlines. But here's the real kicker, the part that highlights the core challenge. Despite all the official rhetoric about reducing reliance on Western technology, sources report that Russia has actually imported over $1 billion worth of Boeing and Airbus parts since the full-scale invasion began. Often, these parts are coming in through third countries or via gray market suppliers. It just highlights this persistent operational gap. They simply haven't achieved genuine autonomy in this critical sector yet.
Right. And that really raises an important point about the technological dimension underpinning all these different efforts. What are the key technological factors you see influencing this complex environment, from the evasion techniques to their industrial limitations?
Yeah, technology plays a really interesting kind of dual role here across these domains. For sanctions evasion, particularly the oil fleet, it's often about the manipulation or even the absence of technology, deliberately disabling those maritime automatic identification systems. The AIS trackers, that's a low-tech countermeasure, but effective. And the complexity of those offshore ship-to-ship oil transfers, that's more about operational security and logistics than high-tech solutions. Then you flip to social control. The digital monitoring and reporting framework for Mifprestone transactions going straight to Rosdrobnadzor, that represents a technological lever for centralized oversight, using data systems to track and, ultimately, limit access. But then when you look at industrial self-reliance, especially in aviation, the picture changes again. Their continued reliance on imported Western parts, despite significant domestic manufacturing efforts, points to a critical technological vulnerability. It clearly illustrates the massive limitations they face in trying to achieve true technological autonomy when cut off from advanced global supply chains.
Okay, so pulling all these threads together, the shadow fleet, the social controls, the wage issues, the aviation struggles, what does this all mean for the bigger picture? If we connect these operational details to the broader international consequences and Russia's internal stability, what are the key geopolitical implications you see emerging?
The geopolitical implications are pretty profound, actually, and they cut several ways. First, on sanctions effectiveness. While the clear aim is to cripple the Russian economy, that shadow fleet demonstrates a sophisticated, resilient mechanism for generating significant revenue. This really highlights the formidable challenge Western governments face in fully enforcing these kinds of restrictions. It's not easy. And that continued oil flow, of course, impacts global energy markets and limits the strategic leverage of Western nations to some extent. Internally, the tightening grip on reproductive health access, driven by those demographic anxieties, has huge implications for individual liberties and the overall social fabric. This could lead to quite significant long-term societal shifts. Then there's the economic stability piece. That surge in wage arrears isn't just numbers on a page. It signals growing internal financial stress impacting businesses and ordinary people directly. This isn't just an economic problem. It carries a real risk of breeding social unrest or, at minimum, degrading overall economic health, which ultimately impacts the state's long-term capacity and stability. And finally, those struggles in the aviation sector really underscore the profound difficulty, maybe impossibility, of achieving true technological and industrial independence in today's interconnected world. Even for a large state actively trying to decouple from Western influence, it's incredibly hard. And this directly impacts not just their civilian economy, but potentially their long-term military-industrial complex and overall economic resilience.
What's really fascinating, too, is how some of these current challenges seem to echo historical precedents. Can we contextualize this scenario a bit? Are there lessons from the past, perhaps, that might inform how we understand Russia's current doctrine or responses?
Absolutely. You can draw some interesting parallels, though always with caution, of course. You could certainly frame the sanctions evasion, particularly the shadow fleet, as a very modern form of economic siege breaking. Think about historical blockades and the ingenious, often clandestine efforts nations undertook to circumvent them. Resourcefulness and opaque networks become absolutely crucial for survival, for maintaining essential supply lines. It's a similar dynamic. Then, the state's intervention in social policy, like using healthcare restrictions for demographic control, that's a recurring feature we see in nations facing what they perceive as existential threats or severe population crises. You often see this pattern emerge during wartime or in challenging post-war reconstruction periods where the state prioritizes collective goals, like population growth, sometimes over individual rights. And finally, that struggle for industrial self-reliance in aviation definitely mirrors past periods of, say, import substitution or drives toward economic autarky. History is full of examples of nations attempting to build independent industrial bases under duress, often at enormous cost and, frankly, with wildly varying degrees of success. It reflects that timeless tension between the efficiencies of globalized supply chains and the perceived imperatives of national security and independence. So, in short, pulling all these diverse reports together, what you get is a comprehensive picture of a nation operating under immense, multifaceted pressure. They're employing a mix of sophisticated financial engineering, covert logistics, alongside some rather blunt instruments of social control and struggling industrial policy. It reveals this complex, ongoing struggle across economic, social, and industrial fronts. And these struggles have direct, tangible implications, not just for Russia's own internal stability, but absolutely for global power dynamics as well.
This deep dive has really offered a rare, quite detailed look at the operational realities, the strategic maneuvers unfolding, often beneath the surface level of news reports. So for you, the listener, as you reflect on this, what stands out most about this really intricate web of challenges and adaptations that we've explored today? Maybe consider the long-term sustainability of these measures Russia is employing. What do they suggest about the evolving nature of state resilience and perhaps state fragility in this current era of asymmetric, often economic pressure?